Hi everyone. Thanks for joining in on in the second of a three-part series on the Central Bank of UAE's model risk management guidance. Um, we'll give it another minute or so before we get started. Saril, can you confirm if you can hear me all right?
Yes, Ashley, I can hear you.
Okay, quick round of introduction for those of you all who had missed the previous session. I'm Ashley Charia and I lead the credit practice at Aptiva. I was also one of the speakers. Nasser and I, who's also on call, were the speakers of the first part where we took you all through the model risk management guidance from Central Bank of UAE. We spoke mainly about the expectations around the guidance in itself. Today's session is more around the challenges around implementation of those guidance. And I'm joined by Nasser, who has extensive experience of working with model risk management for very large banks in the UK. Nasser was also a partner at EY Middle East before moving to the UK. He will be the first speaker of today, and I hand it over to Nasser to walk us out through his half of the talk today.
Okay, Ashley, thank you very much, and greetings to everyone, whichever time zone people are in. Just start sharing then. Can everyone see my screen?
Yeah, it's come up, Nasser. Thanks.
Okay, and you don't see this thing on the side, so it's all clear, yeah? I mean, because
we do see the, yeah, now it's fine.
But you don't see your image and so on, yeah? Which is just for the.
Yes.
Okay, good, excellent. Okay, okay, as Ashley, as you mentioned, so this is about the implementation, so it's complying with those requirements which have now been finalized. So sorry, Ashley has already covered the introduction, and then I think what we wanted to do was just as a reminder to everyone the context. So the final guidelines from the CBUAE were published in December 2022. And then the draft was circulating, I think, since July last year. So people had a lot of time to sort of go through it. Sorry, I'm just going to, yeah. And then, this is a quick summary of it. So the guidelines, whenever you use the word guidelines, it means those two documents, the model management standards and the model management guidance. So MMS and MMG, as it says here.
Nasser, I only see the title slide. It hasn't quite changed.
Really? So I have not.
Saril, can you confirm if it's changed at your end?
Start again, because I was just sharing that.
It was good with me, Nasir.
Sorry about that. Okay.
Okay. So can everyone now see my screen, or?
Yeah.
Okay.
So we are on the episode 2 page, right?
Yeah, and now you should be on the context page.
Context, correct.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, context. You still see context, yeah?
Yes.
Okay.
Correct.
So I was going through the guidelines. So yeah, I mean, these are the two documents which together form when we say the guidelines in general. And the MMS presents the modeling practices that must be implemented sort of as minimum requirements, and MMG expands for specific models. So like probability of default and so on. The MMS stays general things like data and independent validation and so on. The expectation of the central bank is that all institutions are expected to identify gaps between their current practice and what the guidelines expect you to do, and establish a remediation plan to reach compliance. I mean, if you're doing everything already, then there could be very, very, very small gap. But in general, most banks would have a significant gap. So then the gap would be assessed, and then a remediation plan made, and then shared with the central bank. And then this needs to be, the gap analysis needs to be submitted by 30th June, so 6 months after the publication of the final document. And banks must demonstrate continuous improvements toward meeting these requirements within a reasonable time frame, depending on the complexity and the systemic risk of each institution. The time frame will be approved by the CBUAE following the review of the self-assessment. So if you say you will take 10 years to implement, they may say no. So I think obviously it has to be all reasonable, and these are things taken from the guidance. The plan must address each gap at a suitable level of granularity, so that it's understandable, and then it's sort of tangible as well. So that's the expectation of the central bank, and the consequence of non-compliance is that in the event that an institution, regardless of size, is unable to comply with MMS MMG, it must implement a remedial process, which we've just said, and it should tailor it to its own complexity and of the business and of the models. Obviously, if the business is very complex, the models would be somewhat complex, and then it has to be. But these two things need to be taken, and the materiality of those models. And full compliance is expected from institutions with respect to general principles, and then as it says, while alternative approaches can be considered, whatever is said in the MMG, the specific guidance, normally the expectation is that you do exactly as it said in the MMG. But if you want to do something alternative, that is allowed, but then you need to justify it properly. And obviously cherry picking and reverse engineering and so on, some positive bias would not be acceptable. Evidence of an institution defying the general principles of abusing MMS in this way will warrant a supervisory response ranging from in-depth scrutiny to formal enforcement action, which is the same, I think, everywhere in the UAE, in the UK, etc., that banks would want to avoid that type of scrutiny from the regulator or enforcement actions. And institutions that repeatedly fall short of requirements and do not demonstrate continuous improvements, so continuous is keyword, will face greater scrutiny and would be subject to formal and structurally deficient models must be replaced and should no longer be used. So the central bank can say you can't use a certain model if they think that that is the right response. Okay, that's the context, and then a quick summary of the model management standards, which is the overarching document. And there are the general principles. The MMS requirements are split into two main groups: the must, the considered mandatory, and should considered strongly recommended. Simple models are acceptable, so the goal is not to make necessarily very complex or complicated models, but they should be fit for purpose. So simple models are not the same as poorly designed models. That's what the central bank wants to avoid, that the models are sloppy and then the decisions are incorrect, and that leads to instability or whatever. So systemic risk, which is a thing. So it doesn't mean one can have simple models justified properly and everything is transparent, and that's very acceptable. No institution should employ a poorly designed model. Institutions are expected to identify gaps to compliance by 30th June, as we mentioned. Progress towards the compliance, once you've shared your plan, the remediation plan, and the central bank has given you feedback, and assuming that, let's say, more or less they are okay, or by after that discussion you need to move a few dates, maybe make them earlier or later, whatever is the central bank's recommendation, then you will be implementing that to achieve whatever is written in your plan, and then that progress needs to be reported to the central bank on a regular basis. And the MMS covers the following model groups: credit risk, IFRS 9, which is in a way part of credit risk, but yeah, okay. In generally speaking, it's sort of, because it's so important, it's highlighted separately: market risk, counterparty credit risk, capital management, and some other models. Models must be independently validated. That's an important point. That second pair of eyes principle is that the validation team should be separate from the development team. You can't mark your own homework. Yeah. So then there are the key MMS points they cover a suite of model management principles, And there are sort of 7 key areas like data and independent validation and so on, and governance. Model risk is the cornerstone of governance framework, because in a way, if you don't manage the model risk, then in a way you take the credit risk that you take, or the market risk, it could be much more than what you think because of the model risk. So model risk has clear repercussions on other risks as well. So that's important, because it's through the model lens that you would take those risks. So hence it's a cornerstone of the governance framework. Obviously, everyone repeats it all the time that the quality of the model is to a large degree dependent on the quality of the data. So data management is very important. Then do you have enough data? If the answer is yes, if the answer is no, then what are you going to do? If the answer is yes, how are you going to cleanse the data? If there are missing values, how are you going to complete those values? So all those things are very important for the modeling, because otherwise it's garbage in, garbage out. Model development must follow a number of predetermined steps, and then those steps are also mentioned in detail, as Ashley will cover in the MMG. Implementation of models is a key part of the governance process. So once the model has been developed, it needs to be implemented, and in a very sort of strict speak, implementation is not in production. So you need to implement that. It's not in a development environment now, it's in a production environment, but you've not turned on the switch, and for that you need the approval, internal approval, and then you can turn it on, and then it's in production environment. Validation on multiple levels, we've talked about it, and ongoing monitoring is important, so that the model is within the thresholds where it was assumed to be. So this is sort of a quick summary of that. And then a model management guidance, which we will sort of look at the challenges in the second part of this webinar, but at a high level, these are the models that are covered. One important point is that, as the documents say, that even though these are the models and these are the important ones that are covered, and a lot of guidance is given on how you should go about developing and validating the models, obviously far more guidance is required for you to do it, which you need to come up on your own, and the central bank can't give you handbooks on how to develop and validate. So that's point number one, that there'll be much more detail. And obviously, if you've developed models, and everyone has developed models for IFRS 9, you would have some of those, but those may need to be made up to date, those guidelines. And another important point is that even though 6 categories of models are called, it doesn't mean that the guidelines apply only to these models. So if you use machine learning or AI models for marketing purposes, etc., it should be part of your model risk management. Whether you spend the same amount of time and the same rigor on those models, okay, everyone understands, maybe not. Capital models and impairment models are much more in focus than on pricing models, etc., and IRBB than other stuff. But everything is in scope. So that one should not conclude from this that these are the only 6 categories of models which the document talks about, because the document says clearly that this is just are the important categories that are mentioned, but you need to come up with your own for the other ones. So not maybe go through too much detail, but at least mention a few points. So for rating models, a model should be built with internal data, not just sort of bot data wherever possible, because it needs to be tailored to your institution. Just picking a few points. Default rate should be assessed over long time horizons, so that there is stability and one can deduce sort of consequences from it. On PD models, it covers the conversion of rating models to PD mapping and point-in-time PD term structure. So it doesn't have to be just 1 year. Not it doesn't have to be, it has to be over several years, because many loans are more than 1 year long. So you need to have for the lifetime. So that means that you have the term structure, and all that is mentioned in MMG. An institution need to cover a period of PD history that covers at least one recent economic cycle. So, okay. LGD models, minimum LGD requirements state that both LGD point in time and LGD through the cycle models need to be developed. So yeah, then you can see the sort of the impacts. Institution need to assess LGD as long-term average, downturn, and growth scenarios. Macroeconomic models are employed for estimation for IFRS 9 expected credit loss and internal and external stress tests. So you need to sort of validate those models, see that they have been properly built because you're using them. CBUAE expects institutions to use time series regressions to build macroeconomic models. IRBB covers both traditional interest-bearing and Islamic profit-based models. Changes in expected earnings or economic value are captured through several possible metrics: gap risk duration, etc. NPV models, net present value, are commonly used to estimate various metrics used in financial accounting, risk management. You have to discount as well, so that's sort of very basic, but it's because they're so basic, it's important. Models are often deterministic and do not, but you need to do whatever is written and much more than that, whatever you've used to develop those models and validate. So that's a quick summary of that. And the key themes are mentioned is that in both the documents are the management of data. All models require that appropriate good data exists so that models represent an accepted view of reality. The desire to have all models independently validated by teams that have the skills and experience to build the models. So the validation team, the best is that they can also build the model. Someone else will build it, but they should know exactly the build steps so that they can properly validate and give an independent view. And the need or requirement for robust governance that ensures that the models are fit for purpose. This will include sense checking the models, that the output is correct. Even if you've built the model, everything you've done perfectly, but the probability is negative that there's something wrong. So do they capture the business essentials, and so on. So that's important. If it's for credit cards, it has to be different than for personal loans, for mortgages, for commercial loans, for corporate loans, SMEs. So all these things. So this is sort of the summary of the unified themes. And then the implementation challenges. Before we even go to the challenges, a typical approach to the gap analysis would look something like this: that you need to review the documents that are relevant to do the gap analysis. You have them in one place, whether it's the development document that you use for our first 9 model, or the validation reports, or the monitoring metrics, or the regular metrics that you have, and the guidelines of the regulation and some best practice from other. So you need to put everything together so that it's all in one place. Whether you're doing it with a consultant or yourself, it has to be in one place so that you can sort of go through all the sources and and that documentation. Obviously, you would need to make that list and send it to the central bank with your report. So it needs to be in one place. Then you need to identify, meaning whomever is doing this gap analysis and leading it. It could be third-party consultants like ourselves, or it could be someone inside the bank. But that person would then need to liaise with several other people in the bank. You need to arrange interviews and so on, ask the questions after looking at the documents, that why are these, what are the assumptions in the models, etc. So this is the review of documents and files and interviews. That's sort of the first step. The deliverable of that is a project plan and a questionnaire. And then current state understanding, you need to say which are the models that exist, how they were developed, what are the assumptions under those models. So it's an assessment that you need to do of the current state. But one thing is that supposing your model landscape is going to change a lot because you've decided from a business perspective and a risk management perspective to build many models, and supposing those models would be available in 18 months' time, then obviously this whole thing expects that target state you will write down now, and you will say those models will exist, and this is how I'm developing it, and that would be reflected in the gap analysis. So a very important step would be to define a target state, that how your model landscape would look like in a few months and years time. Maybe a 3-year would be a good target state to say, I'm going to develop these models. And if it happens that you say something and then you do something else, that's fine, because people know, regulator would know that things change, but you need to give the best estimate that you have on how many models you would have in the over the next 3 years that you plan to build. So that's an important part. Then you need to take the gap and which are the methodologies and the procedures that you are going to develop those models. You may not know everything, but the best effort. And then you can say, okay, now I'm going to take the gap. I'm going to see, this is my model landscape, let's say in 18 months' time. Some of the models obviously exist because you have them. And these are the guidelines. This is what the guideline wants. And then I'm going to take the gap between what is expected for all those models and what I have done. And that's your gap. And then you will say a remediation report. How am I going to fill in those gaps? So that is the gap analysis and remediation. And then there would be other activities, which would be like liaising with the Central Bank of the UAE, updating them. And then there would be questions from auditor, etc. this is a high-level plan. Obviously, you would make a much more detailed plan, but this is a typical gap analysis plan. So that which we need to submit now or create very shortly and do the gap analysis in the coming weeks and months. And the deadline is 30th June, yeah, to submit it to this central bank. And then the typical deliverables would be a gap assessment. So list of gaps. Best is to do it in a spreadsheet. So you list each gap by each model type. It's very detailed. And then there is a report, which is like a Word document. And then there is a remediation plan that provides how you're going to fill in the gaps. Could be Excel plus a presentation. Excel for the details and presentation as a summary. So those would be the typical deliverables. And if you want to really count all the deliverables, I mean, there would be also the sort of workshops that you will have internally, as well as discussions with the central bank. Okay. And then a typical gap analysis, depending on the size and the complexity of the bank, we've sort of taken an average bank in the UAE as a target. It would be, let's say, a 12-week project. As per that, the other slide, you review the documents, you collect the documents, you review them, you design a questionnaire, and you talk to people. Those are the interviews, and then the current state understanding and the assumptions, and then the target state understanding as well, and then the draft report on what you think initial view of the gaps are. And as you conduct the interviews and read more and discuss more and think more about it, the gaps will become clearer. So that is that. Then the remediation plan, once you know the gaps, how the remediation plan, and then finalize gap report and remediation. So it's sort of easily a sort of 10 to 12 weeks project. So that's that. And what makes it challenges, before we go into the actual challenges, is that the models have multiple aspects. So those are the different aspects of the model. So there is a model type, and that is on the next slide. Then there's, so I quickly show that, so wide range of models. There's a credit risk and IFRS 9 and market risk and counterparty operational risk. Everything is in scope. You may be spending different amounts of time because some models are more important than other models, like IFRS 9, but that doesn't mean you have to ignore the other models. You cannot, because the regulation includes everything: capital management, pricing and finance, stress testing models, asset and liability, financial crime, conduct risk, climate risk, if you have ESG, whichever models you have. And that is the type of model. And then you have the categories of the models. People make that distinction, which will become quite important as you do. Maybe you already make it. What is a model and what is a calculator? So the overarching thing is that models have assumptions in them, like a PD model, and calculator is just multiplication of three numbers, like ECL. So once you have the PD, LGD, and EAD, and you multiply the three, then you have, through ECL, that's a calculator, or RWA. There are no assumptions. You just have to multiply three things, but it's a calculator. You still need to manage the risk in the calculator. So when you say model risk management, it includes the calculator risk as well. If you're doing many calculations, well, if you're multiplying PD, LGD, and EAD, you could multiply it wrong. You could have some fault in it. So everything needs to be sort of governed. So you need to maybe differentiate these categories. Then the method, it could be deterministic, statistical, stochastic, AI, ML. Some people are developing probability of default models for credit cards based on ML models, lots of data available. So ML applies, but those may require different ways of looking at it, and the gap analysis would be a bit different, could be different. Then there's the sector, the retail, wholesale, securitization, could be Islamic finance, and so on. So they're sort of different. And then last, but certainly not least, maybe one of the most important things is the life cycle. That you would need to, in your inventory, you need to say which are the models in production, which you're using, but which are under development, which are being validated. It has to be comprehensive, and so on. So there are many aspects of models that you need to, so hence it becomes somewhat, you need to be tricky, and you need to do it properly. And that's part of the challenge. And then the wide range we've covered. And the typical challenges would be, well, one is the challenge in the scope itself. does the regulation apply to all models? Can we phase out the implementation? So then that is start with the most material models like IFRS 9 and then progressively incorporate, which could be a good solution depending on the bank and how much work for the other one. It needs to be looked at properly, but you can ask those questions. And we've, in our interaction, Basing Hall Analytics and Aptiva, when we've spoken to clients together, etc., this is the type of questions that have come up, and there's a very legitimate point. How to interpret certain aspects of the regulation for trading book or AI models, and the performance monitoring, how does it happen? The trading book came up for some of the large banks in the UAE. Gap analysis and roadmap, how much detail is required to assess the current state? Like all the assumptions in the validation and so on is not necessarily required for assessing but you need to look at all the assumptions collectively, let's say. Obviously, if some assumption is very fundamental, then yeah, you need to look at it. A target state needs to be articulated before the gap between the target and the current state can be assessed. How to describe, because if you have, let's say, 20 models now, and in 18 months you will have 60 models, I mean, it's a bit difficult, but supposing you have, then a lot of effort would be required in your actual remediation plan, because yeah. I think it's quite clear. So I think the target state is also important. How to describe target state of the modeling landscape at one's firm over the next few years. You would need to make many assumptions. Those assumptions would need to be, for example, if you say, I'm going to invest in ABS securities or something, whatever the business strategy is, then those, or more in Islamic, then those would be specific models. So that would be, you need to sort of make assumptions and then do the gap analysis. And if the assumption says that's okay, but I think it is the clear thing, the important thing is that the regulator sees that the proper effort has gone into it, and then there's a clear path. And the path may change over time, because as things change, you can't control in risk management, you can't control the business strategy of the bank. But these are certainly challenges which need to be addressed. And then quickly finishing sort of this part of the presentation, there are operating model challenges, operating model in the sense of like how all this will work, what are the roles and responsibilities and so on, and the governance mechanism and the reporting. So perhaps the biggest challenges for some firms, and it's the same here in the UK, would be the cultural challenge, the change in thinking, that is thinking about the portfolio of models as an analytics capability. Some people think that that analytics capability in the bank is like a service which the bank owns, but that center is a service that provides to the rest of the bank. So how is it set up? What are the SLA type of thing, the service level agreement, and that needs to deliver the service at a certain quality. So you need to think of it as analytics, and you know that data and analytics are very big items, and then many banks are sort of setting up this type of thing, the analytics capability, and how model risk, if not managed, can lead to significant losses. So people need to be aware of it, that if the credit risk models are wrongly calibrated, then it could lead to credit risk losses, and same for market risk. So model risk has direct consequence on other risks. As mentioned before, ongoing training of modeling teams is another area. How are you going to keep them up to speed with the latest developments and latest regulatory and methodology developments? The head of the model risk team will need to have the right seniority and gravitas. If no one listens to that person, it won't be very effective, the model risk. And it has happened. And that you say, okay, it's a tick box exercise. I make a junior person head of model risk management, and that person says this should be done. No one listens to that person. Yeah. So the gravitas point is very important. Actually, it's key. So that person would need to report to the right people, and people should know that what they say will be sort of taken seriously. Implementation challenges, set up specific model risk function to approve independently validated models prior to committee stages. The new function will need to be resourced with skilled individuals who understand it, have done validation and development in the past, and with the different types of models. If you're using people who just have banking book experience for trading book, it will not work. Given that many UA institutions will be in the same boat, finding the appropriate resources, that may be a challenge, or their salaries may go up a lot. Ensuring that the business as usual processes are unaffected by the setup process. essentially a bank's governance structure may need to be reinvented or at least recalibrated. Because now model risk will look into the development, will look into the validation, into the monitoring, will speak to the board about it. So many processes will change, and that needs to be documented. And that's part of the operating model, that the process change. And then you need to implement it so that the right process is in there. So it affects the operating model and it affects the implementation. And if you want to have the training or the initial gap analysis, etc., done by the third-party firm, then obviously that selection has to be done properly, and you need to see that the firm has the right experience, etc. And then you can use them to upskill internal development and even write policies and procedures if you think that your policies and procedures require update. So that's sort of a view of the challenges that we have. Any sort of, I think the questions are for later. Are there any questions? I think there are already quite a few questions. Ashley, how are we going to do? We try to answer the questions later on, and you do your session now, or
we do that towards the end?
Okay. As we said, okay, fine. So I pass it over to you then.
Thanks.
And you want me to run your slides, yeah?
Yes, please. I'm still having trouble with my screen.
No problem.
I, in fact, can't see the screens move. I'm assuming you're on slide 17 or 18? 18?
18 now. So I'll just say very quickly each time. So when I move, so now 18.
Thanks, Nasran. Sorry about this. So the idea next 15-20 minutes is to try and walk you all through what we feel are challenges at a model-specific level. So, and I was mentioning, I predominantly come from a credit background, so I will stick to areas that are comfortable for me. I've picked up areas relating to rating models, probability of default models, loss given default models, and macroeconomic models. And we are coming off tons of work in this space with multiple banks in the UAE. So we'll try and touch upon what we think are challenges that banks will face, or rather improvements that banks might have to do to meet with the true spirit of the guidance issued by the Central Bank of UAE. So we'll start with the relatively easy one, I would say, the rating models in itself. Rating models for banks in the region have been in use for multiple years, decades now, in fact, especially on the wholesale side. So banks have always been validating these rating models predominantly for decisioning purposes, because for capital computation, banks have generally been on the standardized approach. So not too much regulatory emphasis on rating model till IFRS 9 came along. And when banks started using outputs of the rating model, feeding into the IFRS 9 model, there was tons of scrutiny into the rating models in itself. So pretty much all banks do the standard housekeeping when it comes to rating models. They do an independent validation exercise. They do their discriminatory power tests. They do the calibration tests and such like. Everybody in the industry knows that. But if you look at the guidance at multiple places emphasizes on the core of the starting point of any of these models, not just rating models, which is the default data. Nasser earlier on emphasized on banks using its internal data, but the internal data that banks use for building models, that default data, this goes to the heart of any model building activity, isn't it? Be it for capital models, decisioning models, pricing models, or for IFRS 9 purposes. That really is the starting point for almost any model in the credit risk suite. So essentially, our reading is that what the guidance calls for is banks establishing a golden source of this particular data, because anybody in the credit risk analytics space knows this default tag data is not just that. It's much more involved process than just using a 90 days past due definition, isn't it? You've got to account for multiple scenarios. Are there materiality considerations to be taken into account? Let's say an account with very small amount has defaulted. Would you consider that as a default or not? So there's materiality concerns. How do you treat for multiple defaults? Do you consider ever default criteria, or would you consider a curing window and apply some kind of a curing logic to treat multiple defaults? So would you treat defaults occurring along the life of a particular customer's independently, or would you just consider the first one? Treatment for especially when it comes to stage 1 and stage 2, how are these default definitions aligned to those stage 1 and stage 2, stage 1, stage 2, and stage 3 definitions? Also, even the definition of default. Recently, there was a conversation with a bank in UAE where there was consideration around what is actually definition of default. Is it 90 days past due, or is it 91 plus days past due? So things like that. Now, banks, of course, can take its own, view on all of any or all of these points. But the important thing is this has to be an institutionalized process. It cannot be a process that is decided year on year by either the modeler who's working with this data or the consultant which bank employs to come up with these criteria. This has to be codified. There has to be a process where there is data stewardship happening when it comes to default data. So at least for all the material portfolios, typically any bank in UAE, at least 2 large corporate wholesale portfolios, leaving aside FIs, and at least 4 retail portfolios. This is pretty much the standard mix in any UAE bank. For these portfolios, independent data bases, data warehouses need to be established, and clear data stewardship established for collecting this default data. Essentially, we feel what the guidance is saying is apply all the relevant principles of BCBS 239, risk data aggregation and reporting, at least the aggregation part of it. All of those principles should get applied when it comes to default data collection. And what we found also interesting in the guidance is, I'm sure CBUAE is also well aware of this fact. CBUAE goes so far along to say that once established, historical default rates should only be subject to minimal change. So that should be the extent of confidence an institution has when it comes to establishing the whole default tagging and the default rate series process in itself. Other topics related to segmentation, again, probably slightly less important for wholesale, perhaps more important for retail with a lot of banks that we work with, because on the wholesale, like the guidance says, the segmentation scheme pretty much aligns to what the rating model landscape is like. If there's a model for the wholesale, if there are 2 models for wholesale, for instance, one for the large corporate and one for SME, pretty much the segmentation scheme aligns to those that the rating model segmentation scheme, so as to speak. But again, conversations are to be had, especially for retail, where not all banks have in place scorecards. So especially on the IFRS 9 side, we are seeing conversations around segmentation happening. What is the right segmentation to use for, let's say, a mortgage portfolio where an existing application or a behavioral scorecard is not in place? Again, so segmentation related conversations need to be had, and I realize it's not just a rating model conversation, it's also a downstream IFRS 9 related conversation. Other aspects like overrides are already being considered by most banks, but again, the guidance emphasizes on one, controlling overrides. The criteria that's used by most banks is that anything upwards of 25% of overrides happening, the model really needs to be looked at. Again, this is on the wholesale space that we've seen. But this number pretty much comes from a very old Basel guidelines. A number of banks in Saudi Arabia also follow this particular process, and it's almost like a risk appetite limit pertaining to model risk. So this is a criteria that's oftentimes employed. When it comes to monitoring and validation, the guidance, while there are overarching statements and guidance being provided on the independence of the validation exercise, the role of internal audit and such like, there isn't anything specific when it comes to the rating models as such. But on the overall, the rigor of the validation exercise and the independence of this, we've already covered this in the first session. Quickly moving on.
So now we are on slide, sorry.
Slide 19.
No, sorry, there was a problem. Okay, so I think because whatever you mentioned, so I think those things are displayed. Yeah, okay. So now we are on slide 19, and I've displayed everything.
Okay, all right, thanks.
Yeah.
So again, just nomenclature on this particular slide. Essentially, this is the topic that rating models typically throw out grades. How do you convert those grades into probability of default estimates, be it through the cycle or PIT in nature? Firstly, banks, I think there is not enough emphasis on rating model philosophy in itself. Generally there is a consideration that wholesale rating models, they are TTC in nature. Anything on the IFRS 9 space is PIT in nature. Again, there has to be a formalized framework for banks to look at in terms of assessing whether these models that we consider TTC are indeed TTC in nature. On the PIT side, predominant usage is on the IFRS 9 side. So there we feel certain standardized practices have evolved now, and CBUAE again goes to and mentions a number of possible approaches for this PIT conversion, so as to speak. So before we move to the next slide, just some nomenclature. We will be leaving this slide deck with you because there's a lot of confusion, especially around people new to IFRS 9, about what conditional PDs are, what forward-looking PDs are. When people use the word PD term structure versus 12-month PDs and such like. So again, it is useful for the bank to establish this vocabulary at an institutional level, so that when one team talks to another, when one model team, be it development or validation team, talk to each other, they are very clear when somebody is saying forward 12-month probability of default, what it exactly means. So we feel again it's useful to institutionalize such definitions at a model risk and model governance level. If you could move on, Nasser, to slide 20.
Sure. Yeah. So I'm showing everything. Yeah.
Okay. So again, the central bank has said, has left it to the banks to sort of figure out what methodologies it can use to do the PIT conversion. Currently, most banks that have TTC models in place convert to PIT via the TTC. That has sort of become the industry norm. But obviously, you could completely avoid the TTC probabilities of default and directly do a PIT PD calibration, which some banks in the West are doing that. So, essentially saying, what is the need to go via TTC to PIT? Let's do a PIT calibration directly. And even within calibration, again, what we find with a lot of banks are some of the calibration processes, while I mean it's really getting into the weeds, so as to say. The calibration function being used, the types of curve fitting procedures that are being used, there is a lot of scope for standardizing these procedures as well. Again, model risk standards need to be established at an institutional level to provide guidance to both the development and validation teams on these fronts. So, considerations like, are we going to do a, single curve fitting? Are we going to do a multi-curve fitting to a single scale and such like? All of these consideration, again, we feel needs to be codified. CBUAE does not go into great detail on what calibration functions can be used, but the spirit of the guidance is that all of these things also be formalized and codified and not left to the individual model developer or the consultant's discretion. Again, what is interesting is the CBUAE has taken note of some common frameworks that are used for this, PIT conversion. It has said you could use the transition matrices. You could use a scaling approach, which is a very commonly used approach with multiple banks in the UAE, especially for scaling the probabilities of default upwards for stage 2 PDs versus stage 1, or even within segments. CBUAE has said it's acceptable. What is also interesting is that it has made a mention of the Vasicek framework itself, although it's provided guidance and said, look, you can use the Vasicek framework, preferably for portfolios that are not material, and that's understandable because at the end of the day, it's only an analytical framework. We are pretty much lifting the ASR framework, which was calibrated to a particular default data set. May or may not apply to your individual institution. So CBUAE has said you can use these frameworks, not an issue, but be mindful of the risks in using a few of these frameworks is what central bank has mentioned. If you can move on.
Yeah, sure.
To the slide.
But sorry, just one comment on what Ashley you were saying. So I think it's very similar with the Bank of England as well. So supposing someone thinks that a certain approach, scaling approach, is not as sophisticated as another approach and so on, I think the sophistication of the approach is certainly an important thing that one needs to take into account. And the more sophisticated the approach, ideally, the better the result if you have the right data. But it looks like for many regulators, that's not the main focus. The main focus is the transparency, that you've chosen a method, you can provide a rationale for it, and you take it, and the method makes sense. It's fit for purpose. So transparency of the whole thing, rationale, and then right business outcomes, and that needs to be justified and properly also documented, and that is more important than necessarily trying to go after very sophisticated methods. If you can do both, then even better, but the first point is more important.
Thanks,
yeah.
Okay,
so slide 21 now, and
macroeconomic models. Macroeconomic models, interestingly, the guidance goes into a fair degree of detail and talks about very, very practical aspects. So it goes into, firstly, it says, basic tenets of macroeconomic models. It recognizes that these models are predominantly being used in the IFRS 9 space at this point in time, also for stress testing, but stress testing models pretty much use the IFRS 9 models as the engine for most banks in the UAE, especially on the systemic side. One, there is that recognition. Two, some broad principles laid out. One goes back to data collection, the data series itself, establishing that. We've already spoken about that. So when it comes to analysis of the dependent and independent variable, it goes into fairly great detail, technical detail, and mentions that things like stationarity, because we are dealing with time series data, stationarity tests need to be considered for the dependent and the independent variables. While this is feedback that central bank has given in the past to individual banks, it's interesting that they've gone to the extent of providing a formal guidance on this particular matter. On variable transformations, again, it has listed out a number of transformations non-exhaustive, but it has listed out a number of transformations that banks can use. And what I found interesting was that it has thrown its weight behind models like autoregressive models, which some banks, especially on the people from the business side of things, look at with a fair degree of suspicion, because the setup is a little unintuitive, not very natural. But the central bank has said, autoregressive models are good to be used. Be mindful of so and so tests while you're making your variable selection test for stationarity. And it's gone so far ahead as to list down a set of possible tests that it can use. So essentially, if you're building an OLS model, all assumptions of linearity, starting with multicollinearity, autocorrelation, heteroscedasticity, and such like, and the tests that you could potentially do for these, they've all been listed down. Also, what is good about the guidance is that the central bank does not insist that you've got to pass all of these tests. What it insists on is consideration be made for these aspects when you're modeling for when you're building macroeconomic models. And I think it comes from a sense of practicality, because it is fully aware that banks in the region deal with very short time series. At most, what most banks have is a time series that spans one economic cycle or just beyond. So you're essentially dealing with about 7 to 8 years of data, and one also has to look at availability of macroeconomic data. So when you look at the combination of these two, you're left with barely enough data points to build a valid model. So I think there is practicality from the central bank on that aspect. It is also said that, interestingly, what is also said is banks can consider doing outlier treatments and smoothing the default rate series if it so chooses to do. And this again is particularly important because especially the last couple of years, the COVID years, the default experience has been very, very different from the previous years. So with most of our clients, we've been doing, and most banks have gone through this moratorium phase, isn't it? So with most of our clients, we've done some deferral analysis to understand what effects of this moratorium, what is the effect on the default rate series, and some adjustments have been made. And it's great that the central bank has come out in support for such adjustments to be made to the default rate series, because without with auditors asking all sort of questions, we have some backing in the form of this guidance to go back and say, look, the central bank themselves are okay with this kind of treatment. So that was on the macro models piece. I think we'll try and wrap this in the next 5 minutes or so. Next slide.
There are 8 questions now, just for us to know. There are 8 questions. So now it's the slide 22 with everything displayed for LGD.
So we'll do LGD as the last slide for today. So LGD models, again, these models have been in place with almost all banks in the region in some form or the other. The pre-IFRS 9 banks were looking at LGD models predominantly on the wholesale side of things in the guise of facility risk ratings. That's how LGD models were used. But with IFRS 9 sort of taking the lead on this, almost all portfolios have seen LGD models being built. Again, the guidance emphasizes on consistency of the data sets that are being used on the probability of default and the loss given default side. I mean, and this is a topic that everyone is aware of by now. Essentially, any defaults that have been recorded, they need to be considered both on the probability of default as well as loss given default side. The other aspect that we've looked at when it comes to loss given default models is data is sparse for most banks. There is not sufficient data in place. And I know there are a lot of papers that talk about building multi-stage models. So essentially building LGD models that look at particular recovery paths. What is the path to cure? What is the path to liquidation? What is the path to recovery? What is the path to one-time settlement and such like. Now, in all of the LGD modeling exercises that we've built, we genuinely feel in the lack of data, while such models can be built, single stage models work just as well as multi-stage models, because data is so scarce when it comes to things like liquidation, one-time settlement, to actually make a robust assessment of the probability of recovery going down that path. We feel multi-stage models really do not work for portfolios of the nature that we see in the UAE. You're better off building a single stage model, or that looks at what is the default rate at a portfolio, and then to work your way from there on to look at segmentation schemes within that. Also, what sometimes people forget is sometimes if a facility is secured with collateral, for instance, it is the presence of collateral that will act as a strategic threat. It may not go down the liquidation path, but it is the presence of collateral that ensures that some recovery comes off, maybe through a cure. So we feel single stage models work just as well as multi-stage models. Again, does not find too much mention in the CBUAE guidance, but what the guidance does talk about is building loss given default models that are sensitive to macroeconomic variables. Again, data is scarce to sort of do this, but some analytical frameworks are available to look at loss given defaults period on period. You could potentially set it up in a way to look at tag loss given default to years of particular default, and to build some time sensitive loss given default models. And when it comes to validation of LGD models, again, there aren't a whole host of quantitative validation tests that one can perform. These tend to be largely qualitative in nature. Validation tends to focus on the assumptions that have gone in, the assumptions of time to recovery, what is the definition of ultimate recovery, if the workout LGD is the framework that you've used, what is the cost of recovery that you've used, discounting rate that's being used, and such like. So that's the typical validation approach that we see in the region. Not a whole host of backtesting being done, because data is scarce in general. Not a whole host of out of time validation at least being done. So that was all we wanted to cover. I think we covered 4 model types in today's series. Maybe we take a look at some of the questions now.
Yeah, and then just to mention that there are more slides which are prepared, and when you get the slides for the participants, then you can look at some other stuff as well. Yeah. Okay, so shall I bring up the questions now? I have to be sort of quite quick. So we start with the questions, yeah?
Sure.
So is it okay to sort of have them on the screen, or how is it?
I think it's fine. We could do that.
Okay. Okay. So applicability expectation CB, can you see the questions, Ashley?
I can.
So you want to sort of start then?
So I think question 1 is a regulation related question. Is it applicable to every institution? How about foreign bank branches? Our interpretation is that by virtue of this being applicable to the banks in UAE at a group level, it needs to comply. So I think that the regulation is very clear on. And if one has to comply at a group level, if the other entity does not comply with the CBUAE regulation, then I'm not sure that how group compliance would be achieved. So I think the answer there is all entities would be expected to comply with Central Bank of UAE's MRM guidance, unless perhaps an exception of some sort basis materiality or the kind of holding that is there. That's perhaps the only reason why a foreign entity would be exempt.
And just very quickly on that, I mean, if the foreign bank, in the home jurisdiction has even more stringent requirements and so on, then it may be very easy to say that that is fine because they are already complying with those things. So sometimes this also happens. But as Ashley said, I mean, it may be on a case-by-case basis that they would decide. Okay. And just as a side point, I mean, we've compared the regulation in the UK, in Europe, in US, and the UAE, and some other places, and there is a lot of commonality. So, I mean, obviously, the prescriptive nature of some of the things, the stuff that Ashley covered, like the tests and so on, are not given by other regulators. But like the Bank of England or the Fed would allow you to choose whatever you want, but just justify it, because that's like part of the handbook. But we understand why CBUAE has done it, and it's a good thing to do, because I think the maturity of the market in general is sort of a bit different. So it's good to give more guidance. But the overarching guidelines, guidance on model risk management across different regulators are very aligned. A lot of emphasis on data, on independent validation, on monitoring, on governance. Okay, I think in the interest of time, the next question, can you assume macroeconomic model within GCC? Sorry, you were going to take that.
Two questions pertaining to COVID, and I'm going to read them out together. One is there any COVID specific guidance in the MRM? And the other related question is, are banks using COVID data in model development? I'm assuming the years of the COVID period, is that being used in model development? Most banks are using the COVID period in model development. Some adjustments are being made, I feel, but banks definitely are considering that data for model development in UAE, in Saudi Arabia, in Kuwait, in the GCC at large, I feel. In the MRM, I'm not sure if there's mention of COVID. I don't recall.
No, I don't think. I mean, we together, I think we went through the whole thing several times, but there was no specific mention. Yeah, but I think you've answered it. Sorry, Esther, just to mention, I think we forgot this question here. So the second one, can you assume macroeconomic model within GCC, that is in Saudi, to remain same? If not, what is the expectation of the central bank?
I think individual all the the GCC countries have forecasts that are publicly available. I mean, third-party sources definitely available. There is macroeconomic data available on an actuals basis, as well as forecasts for UAE, for Saudi Arabia, for Bahrain, Kuwait. All of these entities have individual data series. So definitely the expectation is that the particular macroeconomic data be used. Of course, other considerations like, I mean, a client of ours is based, for instance, both in Bahrain and in Saudi Arabia, and sort of like they have clients that sort of are present across both these geographies. So then what do you do in this particular situation? Then it gets a little tricky. You look at aspects like what is domicile, and split that portfolio further down by the the branch that is sort of assuming this risk. But otherwise, one would imagine individual data series need to be used.
Right. So then there is another one which I can maybe quickly answer, is when there is a deficiency model in the model, what is the CBUA's expectation to comply necessary changes? So I think that would be part of the remediation plan. So you would say these are the changes that we will make, and this is over this time frame. So they would certainly want that deficiency to be closed. Ashley, anything to add?
No, nothing to add.
Next one is how cross-default criteria should be considered as default. Definition.
I forget what the CBUAE guidance is, and there is specific guidance from the CBUAE as well as SAMA. SAMA definitely mentions that cross default has to be applied across portfolios and the question really is, For wholesale, I think there's no debate. You've got to apply the cross default criteria. For retail, SAMA's current stance is that cross default be applied. So essentially, if a customer defaults in on the personal finance portfolio, he be considered as default on the credit cards portfolio also. I do believe the CBUAE, the UAE banks also follow this particular schematic. But that being said, there are banks that believe very strongly that the wholesale book is handled on a relationship basis, on an individual customer basis. This is pool-based lending. Really, those principles don't apply. So there's a little bit of vagueness there when it comes to application of cross default criteria. I see two questions related to backtesting, one from Anonymous and another from Nivedita. How are banks backtesting LGD, and what Nivedita's question is about frequency of backtesting and what tests can be applied. So as I was, interestingly, I hadn't seen this question when I was walking you all through the LGD slide. So LGD validation tests, if you look at literature on LGD, they do talk about similar validation tests that one does for the probability of default side. All literature points to you could run a receiver operator curve, you could do an ROC, Gini, and such like. But all of those literature points to the fact that if you set up a facility risk rating model with FRR1 to FRR4, so there are multiple LGD tranches available, then yes, you could absolutely look at discriminatory power of these individual pools. But most banks in the UAE, I'd say about 80% of the banks, do not have gradations within LGD. Most banks are working with a portfolio estimate of loss given default, in which case none of these principles really apply. The only backtesting that one can do is to look at how additional quarters of recovery data that has come in, how does that fare with the earlier data. And really what banks are doing right now is, because unlike probability of default data, a 7-year vintage of loss given default data is just not good enough. So really they're just updating their LGD models every time a validation exercise is being done. So that's really what we are seeing at this point in time.
Okay. Actually, there was one more question that we missed. So are all models in scope, or is it the focus on IFRS 9? So all models are in scope. Anything to add?
No, all models are in scope, I think.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Do all models go through the same rigor, or should there be some tiering? I think you had a nice slide which we could not cover, but you want to quickly answer that question?
So yeah, I mean, once you get the slide deck, you'll see a couple of slides that talk to tiering. The idea is that absolutely tiering needs to be set in place, and we like to think of tiering as a function of one, materiality of the models, like models that are capital models that are.
I'm actually showing the tiering slide very quickly. You don't have to, maybe just for people to see that it's there. Yeah.
Sure. So materiality. So that is one aspect of tiering. Absolutely use that, I believe. But also, what is important is to look at sensitivity of these models. Now, take a probability of default model as an example. So in an IFRS 9 setup, if you were to check for what is the sensitivity of an ECL estimate to a probability of default model, you will find that for every percentage change, about 0.95% change in ECL you will see as part of, so highly sensitive. The ECL is highly sensitive to changes in probability of default model. On the other hand, if you were to look at something like an EIR model, changes in EIR, how would they impact changes in loss given default via the discounting that is happening, and what will its impact be on the ECL in general? That would be minimal. So while the portfolio materiality is very, very high. In terms of sensitivity, and I know I'm using a slightly absurdist example by selecting a sub-component of an LGD model, but this is a good way to think about sensitivity of these models. So one, look at materiality, two, look at sensitivity. This can be a good framework to look at tiering in general, a combination of these two. You tier models up, and then of course purpose of the models in itself. Some banks have economic capital models that are not really used for regulatory purposes, or even for provisioning purposes. It's just FYI. So and those perhaps get very low in terms of very low score in terms of utilization, or in terms of purpose. So a combination of these dimensions can be used to set up model tiering, and the validation rigor, monitoring rigor should be commensurate to the tiering class of the model.
Okay, so I think very quickly, okay, should model risk appetite be set explicitly? Yeah, it's also, if yes, who should set it? Yes, I think, I'm not sure whether the regulation CBUAE wants it explicitly, but it would help you in implementing the regulation to set it. Some other regulators want it to be set explicitly, and most of the banks that we work with have set it explicitly. Now, explicitly also means whether it's at the top level of the institution and how you cascade it down. So I think to make it practical, the risk appetite should be, model risk appetite should be set at the top level and then cascaded at least to some levels, which means that you can say, okay, what is the overall risk acceptable for mortgages? It could be prime mortgages and subprime mortgages, and then it gets aggregated, and then there would be an aggregate at the top level of the bank. And that could be a very sophisticated approach like model risk quantification, or it could be a basic approach like red, amber, green, and so on. And then you run into questions like, do two ambers make a red, and that type of thing. And many banks then sort of try to answer that question in some sort of reasonable way. So the answer is yes, it should be set explicitly, not necessarily required by the regulation. If yes, who should set it? Because the regulation, the implementation of the regulation would become easier. And if yes, who should set it? Ashley, is that correct? Also, that your understanding that the CBUAE has not explicitly asked for it to be set, but I think the expectation is that in a governance setting it would be set.
And I think if one were to read this along with the ICAP guidance that was issued post the model risk management guidance, the ICAP guidance interestingly makes several references to the model risk management guidance. It has pretty much said, one, all Pillar 2 models have to be brought under the ambit of the model risk guidance. So that's one. So whatever is applicable there is applicable for the ICAP models. Second, what it's also said is model risk has to be assessed. So just by making it's a small paragraph that they've put in the ICAP guidance, and they've clubbed it with model risk, climate risk, and such like. You've got to make special consideration for this. So we think over this ICAP cycle this year or the next, banks in the UAE will start codifying and assessing model risk, sort of trying to quantify. It will, I believe, take the form of scorecards initially, before banks try and do something too sophisticated. And scorecards, the type of scorecards we've seen in the past, again, looks at models from a model health perspective. So, how are these models generally performing in terms of the monitoring scheme, in terms of model monitoring, performance outcomes, etc. The other is model impact in general. So, what is the purpose of this model? Is it a material model and such like? So, scorecards around these two broad themes, we feel, will come into the vogue over the next couple of years in most banks, I feel.
Okay. We've sort of run out of time. Shall we continue with the questions, or we stop here?
I think we'll take the last one.
Sorry?
I think we take one more and call it a wrap.
Okay, so I think one can be answered I can answer very quickly, but then we can take one more. So is model risk management independent from model validation? So in large banks, there would be a separate function called model risk management. I mean, it's not 100% independent, but it'd be separate function, but working not independent in the sense of difference between development and validation, where you have to check the work, but model risk is cross-cutting, so it would be a separate function. But in smaller banks, there would be people who would be sometimes doing validation and model risk management, so two hats. So the activities are different, but it ends up fewer people the bank has, so some people end up doing it, but those functions are reported separately and sort of separate. It could be one person doing it. But the other last question then is parameterization in third-party model, black box features in third-party, IFRS 9, climate risk. What are the CBUAE expectations?
I think CBUAE has a section on vended models, and it's very similar to the US regulators SR 11.7. One is essentially saying it is not enough to say it's a vended model. We don't know how the model works. So, I mean, that should set the alarm bells ringing for a lot of banks that use IFRS 9 models that are black box-ish in nature. So, two, a lot of banks rely on validation reports that are provided by the vendor themselves. I think there is verbiage in the guidance that says that's not quite enough. There should be ability to independently validate these models to understand all of the workings and mechanics of the model. So yeah, I think the guidance does go a little light in terms of allowing these vended models to continue, but a fair degree of onus being placed on the model users to establish that the model is fit for use. This is what I sort of recall in the guidance.
And maybe one more thing to add to that is that based on our experience here in London, many of those vendors who supply those models are thinking of supplying more details to their clients because of their model risk governance requirements. Because if you buy a model, then supposing there were two vendors and one would give you more information, which would allow you to comply with your internal and regulatory, and everything else was the same, then you should choose that one that gives you more information. Because in the end, you are the bank and you are making decisions based on that model, and rightly regulators think that it's your responsibility to be comfortable with the model and to make the board comfortable and the regulator comfortable. Okay.
I think we've overshot by 4 minutes. Apologies for that. But thank you all for coming in on the session. I hope you found this session useful. There is the last part of this 3-part series comes up in about a couple of weeks' time. Looking forward to seeing you all. Thanks once again, everyone. Thanks, Nasser. Thank you.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you. Cheers.
Cheers.